Hello and welcome, I'm Dmytro Boyarchuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Ukrainian parliament has approved the state budget for the following year with over 2,000 amendments proposed by MPs. The minimum wage will be increased and the defense expenses will grow. To talk more about the state budget for 2020, we welcome to our studio today Dmytro Boyarchuk, Executive Director at CASE Ukraine. Hello and thank you for joining us, Mr. Boyarchuk.
Hello.
So the parliament received more than 2,000 amendments and around 800 were taken into account. And the draft budget went through the first reading. What are the main indicators of this budget?
So far we can say that this budget is quite conservative and realistic because, for instance, the Ministry of Economy project 3.7% of growth for GDP, but the budget which was provisionally approved, first reading, was actually approved without changes to macro forecast. Which is basic 3.3%, a bit lower than Ministry of Economy targets. Actually, it's a good position in my opinion because finances should be quite conservative. They should have conservative target. If there will be more growth, more revenues, it's better to redistribute than to make some budget cuts.
Now you're referring to Mr. Boyarchuk's statements about 5 to 7% of GDP growth?
It was not considered this target at all, and even in projections of the Ministry of Economy recently updated, the projection is 3.7% for 2020. So budget is realistic and conservative. It presumes mainly increase of spending on education, healthcare, and on
military defense.
Defense, to large extent, expanding on defense, they will remain flat. But for instance, they had so-called hidden spending on defense. They were envisaged at the budget of the Council, Security Council. It will be redistributed. It's not clear for what specific areas. But again, we are talking about first reading, and usually till the final approval of the budget, we'll have a lot of changes. Again, it's not clear how this projection of Ministry of Economy and targets of Prime Minister will be considered. But for instance, we do not see at the budget potential revenues from privatization. We know that Ministry of Economy has already made first moves to privatize 800 companies. I don't know which will be large or small sold, but in reality, So
the revenues from the privatization are not enshrined in the current draft budget. But we also cannot really hope on privatization since it has been failing year after year. So now we have to see whether the government will be efficient and effective enough to be able to implement privatization in the upcoming year. But you said that the draft budget is changing from reading to reading. How much has it changed after the draft budget was just presented, and what is your forecast about the possible changes after the first reading?
On the revenue side, it just increased something like 17 billion, so it's almost unchanged, we can say, because the budget is more than 1 trillion. They increased targets specifically for profits of state enterprises.
What is the deficit?
Deficit is 2.1% of GDP, 95 billion.
How big is it? Comparing to current year and to previous years?
This deficit is modest. This deficit is modest. For current year, we also have deficit target 2.2% of GDP. So it's very close, but it's 85 billion hryvnia. So over the last, let's say, 4 years, we have very modest deficits, and it's very cheering for the IMF and for foreign investors which buy our debt securities.
What about the inflation rate?
Inflation rate is targeted at 5% ETD, so it's close to the target of the National Bank,
Which is more or less okay for Ukraine.
I think actually it's high, but for Ukraine it's low, and we have inflation targeting, and for this year we expect that inflation will slow down to near 6% by the end of the year. And if nothing happens, something like new shock or price shock on the external markets, I think 5% will be is a reasonable target for us.
But some kind of shock or world crisis is expected in 2020, starting from the United States of America, and we see that the budget is calculated at the rate of 28.2 hryvnias for $1. How realistic is this, and maybe how realistic could the budget be if the world faces the economic crisis?
First of all, we have been not we, but in general, the world have been anticipating new crisis already for a few years in a row. And every year it was discussed that the world economy is slowing, and we have trade conflict between US and China, Europe is slowing, etc., etc. But yes,
now US and Europe also.
Yes, it's true. But if we have a look on statistics, it's quite controversial. On the one month we have quite disappointing numbers. Next month they are not that bad. But for Ukraine, yes, we will be affected if there unfold new world crisis. Definitely, we are a small economy. And how, in what way we might be affected is difficult to say. For instance, we already experience negative impact on our industry. It's stagnating. Currently, we are growing actually from two sources. We are exporting our grains and we are exporting our labor force. We have remittances from workers from abroad. But industry is stagnating. We have zero growth, almost zero growth by September.
Can we expect currency fall more than 28.2 per $1?
So far, this projection probably will be too pessimistic because we have inflow of foreign currency from non-residents, which turned very optimistic on Ukrainian capacity to service debts. They invest not in enterprises or some production. They invest money into our sovereign debt security, state bonds in hryvnia. And this tendency keeps hryvnia quite strong. But any change of tendency in the world or in Ukraine, any serious political crisis, they might change their mood drastically, and we'll have some more radical volatility at the forex market.
Speaking of debts, in 2020, public debt payments will total about 438 billion hryvnias, and at the same time, Ukraine plans to borrow about 380 billion hryvnias next year. How is this enshrined in the budget?
Actually, it's in line with the plan, and
so there is no risk.
There will be a risk if we do not have deal with the IMF. To a large extent, all the foreigners which have invested into Ukrainian debts, including hryvnia debts, they basically assume that IMF will make a deal with Ukrainian government. If this assumption fails, we will experience consequences immediately.
As forecasted, the minimum salary will be at the level of 4,723 hryvnias. How much has it grown comparing to previous years?
Something like 15%, I don't remember actually.
15%. So how would you assess the draft budget as of now, the version that went through the first reading, what are the strongest sides of it, and maybe what are the weak spots that you would consider need some amendments?
I would say that the budget is quite fine. So if we do not have any like impressive outlays, any impressive changes, so the budget should be treated as okay, and budget should be conservative. Deficit should be narrow, and we have all these points in this budget. Actually, this budget is quite borrowing, and state budget should be borrowing, because if you have a lot of surprises, probably you'll have a lot of consequences, and usually they are negative. So in my opinion, actually this budget have been developed, draft budget have been developed long time before new authorities came into power. We have a budget resolution in May presented, and this budget is a continuation of this tendency. So I do not have it's fine, it's okay. It's acceptable for the IMF. It should be quite positively perceived by foreigners. They see no surprises. They see capacities of Ukraine to service debts, to pay interest, and to repay the body of the debts. And that's the main point what is expected.
According to Prime Minister Alexei Honcharuk, this budget will be a budget of efficiency and economic growth. Would you agree with this statement?
I don't think that budget has direct impact on economic growth, but as I see, they have rearrangement of social spending, and I think it's a positive move.
Well, thank you so much for your analysis and for your comments. We ran out of time, but thank you so much for being a guest today in the studio.
Thank you for inviting.
That was Dmytro Boyarchuk, Executive Director at Case Ukraine. Thank you for watching UATV, and stay tuned for more.